Hi, my name's Kevin Hicks. Welcome to my YouTube channel, The History Squad. Now today's video is all about horses in the medieval times. In the films they just magically appear, don't they? And then after the battle, you know, they just all nicely go away. But we're going to have a look at what were medieval horses like? Where'd you get them from? How'd you move them around? How many horses do you need? Now I ride horses. And I've ridden horses at Warwick Castle and shot me bow from them and all this. And I always knew at Warwick that we'd got it slightly wrong. The horses we used to ride were far too big. So we're going to have a little delve into horses during the medieval period, mainly from the English side. There's always been a bit of a misconception that in the medieval times, the knight in all his armour and the armoured horse had to be these great big 16, 17 hands giants of horses, the destrier, which came in much later. Now, I got in touch with the British Museum, in fact, years ago when I rode the horse at Warwick, about what were war horses like. And 15 hands, maybe just over, that is your charger, as they were called, your knight's war horse. But he didn't just have a charger, he also had a palfrey. These are the different types of horses. They weren't the different breeds, it was the type of horse, what they were for. So your charger, it's for charging into the battle. Then you have your palfrey, which was a very nice riding horse. Once again, 14 and a half, 15 hands. These horses, though, if they were particularly pretty, they were kept to one side. They wouldn't go on campaign. These were reserved for pageants. So if your knight was riding through town in a parade, going to the joust, he would be on his beautiful palfrey. But he also had another horse, and I didn't know about this until recently, and I find this fascinating. It's called a courser, and this was a fast, sure-footed horse. Pretty much a little bit, I suspect, like a good show jumper, because this horse was kept in reserve. During the battle, he would be saddled, harnessed, all ready to go. Not a case of quite, go on, quickly put the saddle on. This horse was kept ready in case the knight was losing the battle. He would withdraw, get off his charger, ignore his palfrey, jump on the courser and ride for his life. So the courser was a getaway horse, yeah? Ride for your life kind of thing. Well, I know of another courser in history. It wasn't a beautiful horse that could really go fast. It was actually a yellow Fiat, which was held in readiness for Adolf Hitler at the Munich Putsch. When he failed, he actually hopped out one side, and this car was there. The door was open, the engine was going, there was a driver, and he had it away. It was his courser, if you like. So in history, people were prepared to run for it. And the knight in question, yeah, he had his courser ready. So he had his charger, his war horse, his palfrey, his riding horse for comfort. And these were his actual favourite horse. His courser for speed, sure-footed. But he also had other horses too, his pack horses. So a knight had lots of these different kind of horses. But of course, knights weren't the only ones who rode horses. You had your man-at-arms, the guy who was just below the knight. He might be wealthy, have a handful of horses as well, plus his servants' horses. Then you had your mounted archers. If you take Henry V's campaign up to Agincourt, apparently his archers were all mounted. Then you have your hoblars, the light cavalry. Now the Welsh were famous for these men, and they rode ponies that were called a jenner. These light ponies, swift, sure, small, ate less, cost less, so they were favoured by pilgrims. And they were also favoured apparently by the ladies because they were a nice, comfortable horse to ride. But where did they come from? You never see in the film, do you, that they have a stud or they have a horse trader. And this is something that has fascinated me now that I've started to look into it. So your horse breeders, your itinerant horse sellers who took horses from the wild and trained them, calmed them down. But the French were absolutely in love with their horses. And I suppose so with the English too. But I do know that the French made a special effort that if they had a good stud, a good breeding line, these horses were often given as presents to other knights, to other noblemen. So you have these different kinds of horses known by what they did. You have your studs, your breeders, but what you have next is all of the people who actually are involved in the horse business of the medieval times. So you've got to look back at the castle, the nobleman's home. You have one man who oversees everything to do with the horses. He is the marshal, but he has a lieutenant. He is the constable, and he is the count of the stables. Constable, don't you just love this? So the constable was the guy who was responsible for the fine end of the training. So the parade horses, the jousting, and getting horses ready for war together with the marshal. Now, training a horse for war, it's not as straightforward as you'd think. And I have just a tiny little bit of experience in this. In working with horses, putting the heavy saddle on, the different harness that they have, the different armour. It's not as straightforward. I know this to my cost, having mounted a horse in full armour that had never been mounted in full armour before. And it threw me. Boy, did it hurt. So you've got to start off with the basics. Make sure he's comfortable with the saddle, right? Make sure if he's got a chamfer and the armour for the nose that it is comfortable. And if you're using weapons, make sure that the horse knows what you've got. So show the horse the sword. Make sure the horse can see the lance. And all of this painstaking work, slow. But it then revolves around, in peacetime of course, the joust. When you see the knights in armour jousting, they're practicing. They're using the horses to practice for war. So by the time the horse has gone to the joust, it's used to the heavy saddle. It's used to all of the armour. It's used to the weight of the knight on his back. He's used to the weapons. Gets excited. He likes it. Praising up the horse. You know that business there, you give a dog a biscuit. Well, with a horse, you praise him up and he loves it. So there you have the war horse. He will be trained. He will be used to it. He will enjoy it. And the palfrey, he won't be used to an armoured knight sat on his back. He will be used to that particular rider, the knight, sat on him and enjoying just a nice, gentle ride. He's comfortable. And of course, the courser, he will be trained to race, and to leap over those fences. I love the idea of all of these different horses being trained, but of course, they won't be trained and then left in the stables and anyone can ride them. If you're a nobleman, you ride the horse and then you have the other people who will take care of the horse for you. So there we have the knight, right? He's the guy who does the riding and all of that. But the marshal and the constable, they make sure that these horses are ready. So you will have the groom who will look after the horses. He will really take very, very good care. Then you have the stable lad who mucks out the stables, but he never touches the horses. You have this whole team, don't you? This whole gang of men who literally look after the horses. From the tack being cleaned, being oiled, all the way through to the horse's hooves. You have the farrier. The farrier will go from castle to castle, from house to house, unless you have such a big stud that you have your own farrier. It's interesting to note, people often get it confused, the difference between a blacksmith and a farrier. The blacksmith is the iron worker. He can make a hinge for your door. He makes the blank, the horseshoe. The farrier will heat it, shape it, and fit it to the horse. The farrier is the expert on the horse's hooves. So the knight going to war. Imagine if it's a nobleman like the Earl of Warwick. He's got dozens of horses that are going to come with him. Those are just his horses. His charger, it will have the most beautiful saddles, armour that actually fits his warhorse, this charger. All of that has got to be transported, and you can't interchange the armour very well from one horse to another because it's fitted. The chevron for the nose of the horses, the crine that goes down his neck, all of the different armour has to be polished, has to be oiled, just like the armour for the knight himself. So the logistics of moving the horses and their equipment was absolutely immense. But you never see it in the films, do you? You know, just a good example of how fantastic some of this armour was. Have a look at the website of the Royal Armouries, because they have got some fantastic examples. And if ever you get to Florence, go to the Museum Stibert, because they have some of the finest horse armour in a museum in the world, and it is quite wow. So, transporting all these horses across to France for the various campaigns. Being Kevin, I've actually made us a model of a dockside and a quayside, all of that, and they're loading it all up. But we'll have a look at that in a minute, because the information that I've got for a lot of this was from a book. So I'm reading away, and I will tell you, I do an awful lot of reading. And I'm reading away, and all of a sudden, I'm hit sideways by a piece of this massive logistical jigsaw puzzle that I never even thought of. Have a listen to this. I'll read it out for you. The Sheriff of Essex and Hertfordshire was ordered to collect 1,000 hurdles, that's fence panels, 24 bridges, 2,000 boards, and 200 empty barrels for the shipment of the horses. The barrels are for the water. The hurdles are to fence the horses in, yeah, and the planks to get horses on and off bridges across brooks. I never even thought of that. But then there's another part to this. This is the 1346 campaign, the Cressy campaign. Here it says, for the purpose of horse transportation, out of the 747 ships that formed the Cressy fleet in 1346, some 100 vessels would have been utilised solely for the freighting of horseflesh. Well, actually, you've got to double that, because one ship solely for horseflesh to transport them, you can only get 50 horses on one of these ships. So there were more ships. We've actually done some calculations trying to figure this out, and it blows your mind. So what I've done, made a few models to try and illustrate just how complicated, how efficient it was. But there's just one little thing I found in another book. A knight has his charger, has his palfrey, and he maybe has his courser. Well, that's no good. And here's the reason. You put a horse on a ship, it's got to be cradled, it's got to be held in tight. If there's a storm, some of these horses are going to be injured, some of these horses are going to die. All you need is one sick horse on a confined stable down below decks. Other horses are going to fall ill. So your nobleman, he has to have spares. And this is something I never thought of. So if he has a charger, perhaps he has 2 chargers, perhaps he has 4, perhaps he has 8 palfreys. The logistics in this is absolutely mind-blowing. So, as I say, I've made some models, and we'll have a look, first of all, at a cog, a transport ship. I'll just let you into a secret. It's my old model, the Thomas, that I've stripped down a little bit. So let's have a look at what I've done with this model. My great model Thomas, the cog. So what I've done is I've loaded him up with wagons for the baggage train and some of the folk who would be busy. The one thing that interests me is how they loaded the horses onto the actual ship. So we've got a ramp, a loading ramp to the ship, so horses could be brought over. But horses that are going to be loaded down into the hold, they're going to be winched up. They will have a nice harness underneath them, and they will literally be lifted into the air and then down into the hold. But I've found out something quite interesting about some of these ships. Especially in the Mediterranean, they had longer ships that were devoted just for the transportation of horses. And some of the cogs, apparently, the whole side of the ship could actually be opened up and horses could be loaded directly into the lower decks. But then the doors had to be sealed up. It wasn't a case of you can open and close them, because some of them were below the waterline. And I find this quite fantastic. Now, in my model, I've done a great general scene here. You've got bowmen who are being proved. You've got different tradesmen, some men coming onto the ship, and the town gate. So this is just a busy scene by the dockside of the loading of the ship. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to take Thomas away now. I'm going to disconnect him. There we have just the quayside. And I'm going to bring another part of old Thomas. This is a model of the lower deck of my ship Thomas, and I've decked it out in transportation of the horses to show you how they were literally transported. So each has got their own stall, and they have a sling underneath their bellies to keep them upright, and so they can rest as well. You have your stable lads here. They're clearing out the dung, the horse apples, as my old friend Beatrice used to call them. There's a very good water supply for them, and fodder, as well as their own sleeping accommodation. This was downstairs in the ship. So if it's a short voyage going across the channel and it's a calm sea, hey, no problems. But can you imagine if there was a storm or if there was a bit of a rough sea? Horses get seasick. It must have been horrendous. And of course, casualties. So that knight needs his extra horses. There was something that occurred to me while I was putting my models together. Is how do you get your horses off the ship? Now, that's fine if you've got a nice quayside, or your ship can get really close to land. Perhaps you can lower the side of the ship down and form a bridge. But what if you can't? You're stuck. So what you do is you swim your horses to shore. And I've got this great picture in my mind. So you either have a ramp so the horses can go down into the sea, or you winch them and lower them into the sea. So you imagine you're in the sea, you've got 2 or 3 horses swimming around after you. Don't forget, some of these horses are going to be your chargers, your war horses. They bite. Not only that, the horses are going to be scared. So you've got to get enough of them together, and then you, together with other grooms, you will swim them to the beach. Hopefully the hurdles will be in place. There will be paddocks. The horses can be put there, calmed down, fed, watered, so on and so forth. And also you've got to deal with the terrible business of the sick and the injured horses. If they're too sick, they're going to be dispatched. So the logistics of just landing the horses is quite incredible. So the whole thing was organized. So let's say you're on the campaign trail. Away you go, and you are confronted by an enemy. So you're on your horse, your charger, and away you go. After the battle, if you're victorious, of course, you will dismount. Your horse will be taken care of. The marshal will be there. He will ensure that the grooms take the horse, cool them down, do all of the necessary things. But then you've got to deal with the wounded horses. If you've got one that's got an arrow in the shoulder, you're going to have to remove that arrow. And it will be exactly the same techniques as they use on human beings. But there's an extra little thing about this, and I got this from an account of moving expensive horses in France. So they would wash the horses' legs in cheap wine and then smear honey on them. So as they walked through the country lanes, any thorn bushes or anything like that nicked or cut their legs, there would already be the honey and the wine acting as an antiseptic. You see, these people of hundreds of years ago, they took care of their horses as best they could. They knew what they were doing. Because let's face it, all of those horses, they were an incredible asset. Without them, they simply would not have even been able to function. Not just for war. Don't forget, agriculture used a lot of horses too. But that is a whole different subject. Well, I hope you enjoyed our little video there. Quite an unusual subject, really, a different angle for history. Now, if you did enjoy it, like, share and subscribe. And don't forget to turn on the all notification buttons, because with me and Julie, you never know what's coming on down the line with History Squad. But before I go, a quick mention to some of our Patreon members: Ben Jenkins, Will Lancet and Paladin Pariah. How about that one? Thanks a bunch, guys. Bye for now.